The wrists tend to get neglected by climbers since our fingers get all the love, but we should fix that. Today's training routine focuses on increasing wrist strength so we can dominate slopers, reduce injuries, and get the gnarliest forearm pump of our lives. This is probably a kind of terrible business decision because we're not going to sell as many TFCC recovery blueprints if everyone has bulletproof wrists, but what are you going to do? There's going to be 4 supersets. We'll start simple, focusing just on the muscles that control the wrists, but we'll get progressively more diverse, focusing on not just the wrists, but the key muscles nearby. Let's go over the exercises first, then we'll talk about some of the nitty-gritty programming stuff at the end. Superset 1. Our first exercise is going to be wrist supination. Now, as you can see with all the equipment laid out here, there are going to be many variations I'm going to show you. The reason for this is so that everyone can do these exercises regardless of what equipment you have available to you. Supination strength helps avoid unwanted joint movement in your wrist during underclings, allows you to better wrap your hand around holds and adjust force direction, and helps stabilize the wrist to help prevent TFCC injuries and strength links. We'll start off by demonstrating with a lever bar. Now, if you have a loading pin and also then have an anchor system that will work for the loading pin, you can use this as the lever arm. You don't have to buy a new piece of equipment, but we'll show it with the lever arm here since that's set up. For wrist supination, simply going to grab on the lever and you're going to allow the weight to fall down into pronation, which loads the supinators, and then back up to vertical. I do have to sadly say that this is probably my least favorite variation, simply because as you try and progress this, the dumbbells will get larger, which is going to make grabbing and holding onto it a lot harder. The next exercise is going to be wrist flexion. I prefer performing this with the forearm supported. So honestly, an adjustable bench works great because you can adjust it to the height that serves you best, and it's padded, so it gives you a little more comfort with it. When you're performing this activity, I think it's important to keep the thumb on the same side as the other fingers rather than wrapping it around to the opposite. When you do that, generally you get more thumb engagement, which with this exercise is not our purpose, but more importantly, it typically causes you to change the direction where you're loading more the thumb side of the wrist rather than equally loading. So I like to keep the thumb on the same side of the other fingers as you go through the exercise. Wrist flexion is utilized in all grip types on the wall and is paramount to gripping, especially on slopers. When using the Torque Pro to set up for wrist flexion, I just always like to make sure that there's some rotational load on it beforehand, so pre-rotating it before you actually get the exercise going will allow it to have a more even loading profile throughout that range of motion. Superset 2. Next up is wrist pronation. Very similar to supination, you can use all the same alternatives, including the lever arm or the loading pin. So you'll want to choose a consistent grip height when you're doing it with a lever arm or a loading pin, because the exercise will feel very different if you grab it up high versus low. So just try and be somewhat consistent with that. Or you can even use it as a mild way to progress. If your gym only has 5 and 10 pound weights and 7.5 would be ideal, you can choose the heavier one, but go closer up, and your progression over time can be lowering the hand further down on the device. Once you get to the bottom of the device, of course, if it feels too easy, then you'll want to increase the weight again. But to perform wrist pronation with the lever arm, starting vertical, allow the weight to lower it down out to the side, stopping at your end range, and then simply lift it back to vertical. Pronators share load with elbow flexors, aiding performance and endurance. They add stability between the 2 forearm bones, the radius and ulna, which will ultimately decrease unwanted joint movement at the wrist. And ultimately, we are constantly activating our pronators while climbing, whether in Gastons, normal crimps, or even crack climbing. The pronator serves a vital role. The downside of using this device is that there's a lot of load on my wrist right now, and now I'm on vacation on the beach just sipping margaritas. So, working hard on vacation. So that is just a pure limitation of this device compared to the Torque Pro or the Torque Ring. Just a couple more tips with wrist pronation. You might notice, especially at the end, you get a little bit of wrist flexion, so you're not going to necessarily remain perfectly straight. If you're really overdoing it and overflexing, it's just probably a compensation for too much weight because essentially, especially if you're using a device like this, you're trying to get that lever arm closer in, so it's going to be a lot easier at that end range. So if you notice a lot of wrist flexion, lower the weight. If you notice a little bit of wrist flexion, that's totally fine. Same thing at the elbow. Since our pronator muscle does act as a small elbow flexor, it's okay if you get a little bit of elbow flexion there. Obviously, if you're getting a lot, that's going to change things up again, so adjust the weight as necessary. Similar to with wrist flexion, for wrist extension, we're also going to use a support for the forearm, and once again, we'll use the adjustable bench. I also, once again, like the thumb over grip because it creates a more even loading profile across the wrist muscles, so we're not just biasing the thumb side, which tends to be the case when the thumb is underneath. So with the thumb over, you get a more even loading profile to all the wrist extensor muscles. Wrist extension is like the jelly to a peanut butter and jelly sandwich. It plays a key role in overall wrist stability. It enhances joint positioning during crimp grips and supplies critical counterbalance to flexion forces during demanding holds like underclings and slopers. Some people will be able to go through a nice full range of motion with this. Other people might feel it's a little clunky. If it is, I would lower the weight or just start by using a smaller range of motion and then increasing that range over time as you feel comfortable and strong enough with that weight. Now for some people, doing the thumb over position will make it feel harder on the finger flexors or maintaining that grip, which is why they'll naturally want to put the thumb under. But one kind of hack that you can do is use a lifting strap to help support that. Now, I'm going to show it to you not using a lifting strap, but with just this. So like the circle underneath and coming over top, I'll give it a little twist, I'll put it between my fingers, and then essentially I'm just going to want to keep that tight and then get it underneath the dumbbell here, because then it'll help with maintaining that grip. So now I feel like I'm barely holding on with my fingers because the sling or the cordelette is helping with that flexion strength. By the way, if you're wondering what this device I've been using is, it's one of 3 brand new products we just came out with specifically for wrist training. The Torque Pro allows you to perform all the important aspects of wrist strengthening with a single device and virtually any form of resistance. The best part is the design creates a much more even force curve during all of these exercises rather than more traditional methods that create zero stimulus in certain zones. We're shipping worldwide, so check the link in the description if you're interested. And let's get back to having fun. Superset 3. If you've made it this far, your wrists are way ahead of 90% of climbers. But now, we're branching out from the super wrist-specific exercises into some more diverse ones. This way, we get a more holistic approach to wrist-related strength. Of course, if you find these exercises overlap too much with your other training, you can skip them or modify as you see fit. Next up are hammer curls. To perform this exercise, simply grab 1 or 2 dumbbells. If you have 2 available, you can do both at the same time. And then simply flex your elbows while keeping your wrists in the same neutral position, which means thumbs forward and then up. Hammer curls enhance radial deviation strength while increasing stability between the 2 forearm bones, the radius and ulna. This also targets the brachialis muscle, which is the main elbow flexor, which is, of course, very important for climbing. See that shake?
Yeah.
Next up will be tricep extension. To perform this, we'll be using a band and a cable system, since not everyone will have access to a cable system. If you are just using a single handle, rather than having the handle in the horizontal position, turn it vertical, grab on, and then simply perform tricep extension. By holding the handle vertically with the rope exiting as so, it increases our ulnar deviation moment, which helps stabilize the wrist. Now you can also perform this as a 2-handed version if you have a rope handle. And same thing, the rope will help encourage the ulnar deviation that we're looking for. Tricep extension promotes ulnar deviation strength while also combining tricep strength, which is useful for climbing moves such as mantles and stemming. So if you are going to use the band variation, rather than being directly underneath it, which will not get you a lot of ulnar deviation at the bottom, you actually want to be slightly away from it, so the band is kind of almost making like a 45-degree angle away. That way, now I get a ton of ulnar deviation strength at the bottom of the motion here. Superset 4. Now we're really diversifying into functional climbing strength training. Next up is the pinch block lift. For this, simply attach your weight. You can use a loading pin like this or a dumbbell. Grab onto your pinch block and then lift the weight off the ground. We need a shorter loading pin, or a shorter rope would work. The thumb has many muscles that cross over the wrist joint, so increasing strength here will ultimately contribute to overall wrist stability. If you have a history of thumb issues or pain, or have hypermobility in your thumb joint, consider using an ergonomic grip device such as the Brick Pinch Large by Tension, or the one created by our very own Emil Modisett at Hooper's Beta. These devices allow you to train while stabilizing the thumb joint. Especially if you know you're hypermobile here, or like that this joint bends into extension, then you really do want to keep it supported. Using the device here stops me from being able to hyperextend at this joint, which is going to be very supportive. As an alternative, if you have like a clog grip device, like a knob hold, then you can use that instead of the pinch. This is a great alternative if you don't have a good pinch block to use. Up next is the reverse curl. Now with the reverse curl, if possible, it's great to use a flat bar. This is a 35-pound flat bar rather than 45, which makes it a little bit easier. Honestly, if you have an even smaller or lighter flat bar, it's probably going to be necessary to get started with this exercise because it can be quite challenging. If you don't have anything less than a 45-pound flat bar, then you're going to want to use an easy bar or dumbbells for this exercise. Now with this, I like the thumbs to be, once again, over. That way we're not creating too much load on the thumbs themselves, but rather creating that co-contraction that we want between the wrist extensors and flexors. If you're using a flat bar for this exercise, grip width will vary based on the individual and their anatomy, so choose whatever grip width works best for you. The reason that the flat bar is a little bit nicer than the dumbbells with this is just because the natural tendency is to not be flat. The flat bar forces you. You can see my wrist want to curl with this. It's very hard to keep it super flat. So keep in mind as you're doing this, you don't just turn it into a hammer curl over time. Next up is a kettlebell overhead press. As the name implies, you need to use a kettlebell for this. So get into your start position with the kettlebell upside down, and then simply press overhead. Now, the resting position at the bottom will vary for people. Generally at about 45 degrees is going to feel most comfortable. It's probably not going to feel as comfortable if you're all the way out here. It's fine if you're in here. Just feel whatever like end position feels good to you. And as you press overhead, I generally like to allow a little bit of lean with any kind of shoulder press because it increases the distance from shoulder to ear. So it decreases kind of some of the pinchiness you can get with it rather than being here. That doesn't feel as nice on my shoulder compared to if I allow a little lean, I can push a little bit higher and my shoulder feels a lot more comfortable. This exercise targets joint proprioception and promotes co-activation of the wrist stabilizers. By holding the kettlebell upside down, the shifting center of mass forces the wrist and forearm muscles to remain active throughout the movement to maintain balance, something that cannot be replicated with a dumbbell. But if you have a kettlebell grip device, you can turn any dumbbell into a kettlebell while keeping the grip size the same throughout your progression. While the primary focus of this exercise is the wrist, it also provides a valuable shoulder training stimulus, especially for climbers who often neglect overhead work. However, if you have a history of shoulder issues, you should avoid this exercise unless cleared by a medical professional. Programming recs. The order of supersets we presented provides a nice logical flow from specific to more general, but you can reorder them if you prefer. And remember, you don't have to do all the supersets. 3 and 4 are optional. Sets, reps, and relative effort. Aim for moderate volume and intensity. That is, 2 sets of 8 to 12 reps for each exercise with 2 to 3 reps in reserve. For pinch block lifts, it's a little more convenient to do slightly fewer reps, like 5 to 8. This is a good general approach to develop strength and resilience without adding a ton of new load all at once. Once you get accustomed to the load and know you can tolerate it, you can increase to 3 sets per exercise if you want. If you're more experienced and you know that a different volume or intensity would suit you better, then go for it. Frequency. Start with 1 to 2 times a week to see how you respond. You can then increase to 2 to 3 times a week as tolerated. But obviously, wrist strengthening is not going to be everyone's favorite routine to do, so even just doing this 1 time a week can still yield great results. If possible, perform this routine on the same day as your climbing sessions after climbing, not before. If you have to perform this routine on a non-climbing day, just make sure you don't go so hard that you start compromising your rest days and negatively affecting your climbing. Check out the super useful links in the pinned comment, including the new wrist bulletproofing blueprint, and until next time, train, climb, send, and repeat.